This is the Best of the Week on Relevant Radio.
So here's a note that comes in from Andy, and he's in Warwick, Rhode Island. And he says, until now, I've only sent you comical emails. It was a real treat hearing you read a couple of them on the air. It cracked me up when I heard Cyrus refer to me as Anonymous Andy. Thanks, Cyrus. He says, I'd say thank you too. Today, however, he says, I actually have a serious question. It is my understanding that one of the characteristics of God is that he is logical. Therefore, he cannot do anything illogical like creating a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor. It would be against his nature. I was raised and always believed that God created everything out of nothing. Thinking about it now, it seems to me that creating everything out of nothing would be contradictory and fall into the same category as a four-sided triangle. I will always love God, even if I don't always understand everything about him. I'll pause there and say, you'll never understand everything about him in this life, that's for sure. And even in the next life, Andy, when we see God face to face, we see him as he is, as St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. We still won't be able to fully comprehend the truths of God. We'll know him far, far, far better then when we see him face to face than we do now. So in other words, don't feel bad if you can't understand everything, because you could never understand everything about God. None of us can. He says, could you please explain how creating everything out of nothing is different from creating a four-sided triangle? In other words, how is creating everything out of nothing logical and not contradictory? And he says, thank you. And then he signs off, St. Miscellaneous, pray for us. Well, thank you, Andy. You certainly have kept your good sense of humor. Let's look at it this way. So logical is one way for us to talk about God's nature, but we don't typically, at least in terms of theology or philosophy, talk so much about God being logical so much as he is not susceptible to contradiction. Now, his nature is the fullness, the plenitude, if we want to use that word, of all the transcendent categories, and he is these things to perfection and infinitely so. So what I mean is God is all good. God is existence itself. Think back to Exodus chapter 3, when Moses meets God in the form of the burning bush, and he asks him, he's trying to beg off, he's trying to get out of what God is telling him to do, to go back to the land of Egypt and to rescue his people. And Moses does not want to go back to the land of Egypt. He does not want to rescue God's people. He's a fugitive from justice because he killed a guy and had to flee. And then the whole backstory too, being adopted into the family of Pharaoh and discovering his lineage as an Israelite. So this is a really unpleasant task that God was asking him to do. And when he runs out of excuses, the last excuse is, well, if I go back there and tell them that God sent me, they'll say, which God? I don't know your name, so I can't go. And then God tells him, I am who am, which is a very odd construction when you think about it. I am who am. The grammar is not what we would say. And it's implying, as God says this to Moses, tell them I am sent you. He's telling Moses there that he is existence itself. Now, you can understand this in a variety of different ways, but fundamentally, God is giving Moses his name that centers on the fact that he is existence itself, which ties into your question. How do other things come into existence and that not be irrational, or that in some way is not a contradiction of God's nature? And here's why it's not a contradiction. First thing is because nothing can come from nothing. Beings, created things, do not just pop into existence from nothing. In other words, that there's no cause that causes that effect. Cyrus, who's expertly handling the controls of the Patrick Madrid show right now, as he does every day, he didn't just come into existence. He didn't just say, hey, guess what? I'm here now. His parents produced him in the physical sense. And of course, God creates the soul, and the soul and the body are united at the moment of conception. This planet didn't come into existence out of nothing. It was caused by other things that caused it to come into existence. Supernovae and explosions and collisions of celestial bodies, and eons and billions of years of forming and cooling, and then things begin to grow as God creates them. I mean, these are all examples of secondary causes that prove to us, as you consider even the universe itself, everything has a cause. Everything is caused by something before it and outside of it. You were caused, at least the physical part of you, by your parents' union. This radio program is caused by millions of different moving parts. Part of it's me. I cause it because you hear my voice coming through the microphone. What you don't hear are the electronics involved and the radio waves and all the other things that go into it. There are myriad secondary causes, but ultimately there has to be an uncaused cause. Otherwise, you've got all of these caused beings who are not necessary to exist, and we know that because at one time they didn't exist. I used to not exist. Same with you. Everything, including the universe, at one time didn't exist. So it's not necessary that any of these things exist, but they do exist. So how do we account for that? So going back to the revelation that God gave Moses in Exodus chapter 3, he says, I am who am. He's saying, I am existence itself. He doesn't have existence. He doesn't have being the way you have being and I have being. We only have being in existence because God gave it to us. But he didn't get existence or being from anyone or anything. He is from all eternity pre-existing before he created anything. And even that language is really faulty too. But we don't really have much choice because as temporal beings, we speak in temporal terms. We speak about before and after, and back before this happened, that was going on. Well, when we talk about before he created anything, it starts to falter because there was no before in God's reality, eternally existing, because that would suggest that God was in a time before he created time. And that's not true, because when he created time, time began. So this is why it's not contradictory, because in order for all these things to exist, there must be some pre-existing, never caused, never unnecessary, and there are other things too that we could say about God, this being who is the cause of all other things. So that's where we get to the question of creation ex nihilo. That's the phrase in Latin that we often use to say God created everything out of nothing. He's not a limited, finite, quote-unquote God, like, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would suggest, that God became a God. He evolved from being a man on a planet somewhere, and then his God decided, okay, you're worthy to become a God, and he sets him up as a God. And then he had to use, according to the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called, he had to use, their God had to use pre-existing matter and form the planets and other aspects of the cosmos that he is in charge of. He didn't create it out of nothing. They reject that, by the way. But that just means he doesn't exist in the sense that they believe it. But even if he did exist, he would just be a creature. He would have received his being, his existence from some other entity before him and so on. So when we think about God, we're saying it is eminently logical. It's completely non-contradictory to say that God created everything out of nothing. It's not like a three-sided circle or a round square. Those would be true contradictions because they're contradictions about the nature of those things. The nature of a circle is that it's round. The nature of a square is that it's four-sided. And in this case, four equal sides to make it a square. But in the case of God, there is no contradiction there because he's not doing something that's irrational. He's doing the thing that is eminently rational to our puny human minds, and that is God creates out of love. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need entertainment. Although I'm pretty sure that we are entertaining at times, God doesn't need anything. Nothing that he created is necessary for him. He doesn't gain anything from his creation. We gain from participating in his being, in his essence, his existence, not to mention some of the other communicable attributes of God. Some are uncommunicable, like his infinitude, that God is infinitely good, infinitely knowledge, infinitely powerful, etc. We can't possess that in its fullness, but there are dimensions of that or aspects of that he can communicate to his creatures, like existing. So that's how I would at least begin the process of breaking that down. It's eminently logical, because if it were not true of God's existence, then nothing could exist. And one last thought, this comes to my mind, and that is, remember that God doesn't directly cause everything. God doesn't directly cause the iPhone to exist that maybe you're listening to the program on. God causes everything in the beginning. Everything that he created from nothing, he created. Was that the Big Bang? I don't know, maybe. What was it that banged? If it was something that banged into the universe that we have now, well, what was that, and where did that come from? Well, that came from God. But let's assume for a minute that the Big Bang is the moment in which God said, fiat lux, let there be light. And boom, there's the universe and the light and the energy and the matter, etc. That could not have happened unless God, by his very nature, was the uncaused cause, the prime mover. Everything in the universe is moving. Well, things move only because other things cause them to move. Billiard balls on a pool table don't move on their own accord, unless there's an earthquake, maybe, or unless the house is tilting, maybe, or unless there's wind, maybe. But absent those things, billiard balls on the table don't move, and they shouldn't move. And if they did move, you'd probably run screaming out of that house because it might be haunted or something like that. So we know that things don't move, but everything is moving, even down to the sub-molecular level, subatomic level. And they have to be caused to move by something outside of it. So all these things that we talk about, these are part of the nature of God. So that when he causes things in the beginning, he causes things to exist out of nothing. It's the only rational way to account for these things. Unlike a square circle or a round square, those are contradictions. But creating is not a contradiction at all to God. All right, I'll leave it at that. I hope that's helpful to you. You can join me by listening to The Patrick Madrid Show on the Relevant Radio app, live each weekday at 8 to 11 a.m. And thanks for listening.